Hi, my name is Sharmin Anwer. I'm an attorney with Cobb Legal Aid, and I am also the lawyer in the law library here in Cobb Superior Court. I provide free 30-minute consultations to qualifying individuals on qualifying matters every Monday through Wednesday from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. And today I will be giving a presentation on the basics of adoption. So before we get into the presentation of adoption, I'd like to give a little background about who Legal Aid is. We are a nonprofit law firm providing free legal services or assistance to low-income individuals on a number of civil legal matters, and we prioritize issues of shelter and safety. When should you call us? Well, you should call us if you're being evicted, if your landlord refuses to make repairs, if you're experiencing domestic violence, if your disabled child's educational needs are not being met, or if you have public benefits that are being terminated. You can open up an application for intake and screening by phone 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or you can also open up an application online for non-urgent issues. As a disclaimer, this is a general presentation about general Georgia law. For specific legal advice, you should contact an attorney for individual consultation. As I previously mentioned, I do provide individual consultations to qualifying individuals on qualifying matters every Monday through Wednesday from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. in the Cobb Superior Court Law Library. So what is adoption? Adoption is a social and legal process whereby an individual joins a family earning the same rights and status as those born into that family. So basically, it's the process that transfers the rights and responsibilities over a child to the adoptive parents. So the biological parents are essentially transferring those rights, responsibilities to the adoptive parents. And then the adopted child shares the same privileges as those children born into that family. What are some of the requirements for the prospective adoptive parents in Georgia? Well, they must be at least 21 years of age or married, living with their spouse, and they must be at least 10 years older than the child. For residency, the adoptive parent must be a resident of Georgia at the time they file the petition. There are some circumstances where you may not need to be a Georgia resident at the time of filing that petition. There must also be the commitment to become adoptive parents, being willing and able to care for the child, making an unconditional commitment to meet their physical, emotional, medical, psychological, and social needs. And the adoptive parents must be capable, meaning they must be financially, physically, mentally able to have permanent custody of this child. When you are filing for adoption, you file in the Superior Court of the county that the petitioner, the adoptive parent, resides. So if you are the adoptive parent and you live in Cobb County, you would file your petition for adoption in Cobb County Superior Court. The petition typically involves filing an adoption petition along with all other required documentation to the clerk of the Superior Court. You can file the petition in the county where the child resides or is living, or the agency where the adoption agency is located if you have good reason, but typically it is where the adoptive parent resides. So we ask who's going to file that adoption petition. Well, the prospective adoptive parents can file the petition for adoption. The individual, so any single person who meets the previously mentioned eligibility requirements, can file on their own. Married couples, so if there's a married couple trying to be the adoptive parents, then both spouses would have to file jointly. However, if there's a situation where a step-parent, for example, is trying to adopt their spouse's biological child, then the step-parent would just file on their own, not the biological parent as well. You can also have an attorney file the petition for adoption on your behalf. The attorney would typically prepare the petition and make sure all the required documents are also prepared and filed accordingly. One thing I want to do is I want to take a moment to make a distinction between adoption, temporary custody, and guardianship, because these are three concepts that seem somewhat intertwined. So Adoption, first talking about the permanency of adoption. Adoption is a permanent legal arrangement. Once the adoption is finalized, it's very rarely something that can be reversed. It's not a temporary thing, essentially, because what's happening is you're transferring all those rights that the biological parents have. You're transferring it to the adoptive parents, and you're doing that by terminating the rights of the biological parents. So it's a very permanent decision and process. And when you talk about the legal status of adoption, the child becomes the legal child of the adoptive parents with the same rights and privileges as a biological child, including inheritance rights. So really, again, we're transferring those rights and responsibilities to the adoptive parents. Irreversibility, as I'd mentioned previously, adoption is generally irreversible, except in very, very rare circumstances. So it's a very permanent thing. Temporary custody, on the other hand, as the name suggests, is temporary. It's kind of a solution it's a short-term solution for specific circumstances. So when we talk about duration, adoption is permanent, whereas temporary custody is temporary. And as I said, it's a short-term solution. When we talk about legal status or parental rights, the biological parents still retain their rights over the child. So in adoption, the biological parental rights are terminated. It's necessary. In a temporary custody, the biological parents' rights are not terminated. They retain the right to request the return of custody, subject to court approval. So again, that's not something that really happens in adoption. With decision-making in temporary custody, the temporary custodian has the authority to make day-to-day decisions for the child, but significant decision might still require the biological parent's consent or court approval. Court involvement in temporary custody arrangements often involve ongoing court oversight and may require periodic review, which is not really something that happens in adoption once it's all finalized and done. So what is the difference between adoption, temporary custody, and guardianship? So keeping in line with the theme first of duration, right? So with guardianship, it can be temporary or it can be a bit more long-term. So temporary custody, it's temporary, but guardianship can be temporary or long-term, just depending on the specific situation. But regardless, it's not intended to be as permanent as adoption. With parental rights, the biological parents' rights are not terminated. So just like in temporary custody and guardianship, the biological parental rights are not terminated, whereas in adoption it is. The biological parents in a guardianship can petition the court to end the guardianship if they can demonstrate that they are able to resume care of the child. With decision-making, the guardian has a legal authority to make decisions about the child's upbringing, including education, healthcare, and general welfare, similar to the responsibilities of a parent. And similarly with temporary custody, guardianship also has some court involvement where the court appoints a guardian and oversees the guardianship arrangement. The guardian may be required to report to the court periodically. The way I would look at it is adoption is permanent. Temporary custody and guardianship are not permanent, and they're more so kind of meant to still keep the biological parents' rights intact. So as I'd mentioned, parental rights, biological parental rights need to be terminated in an adoption, and consent in Georgia is required, meaning in order to move forward with an adoption in Georgia, you would need the biological parents' consent for the adoption. So this consent must be in writing. Importantly, older children who are being adopted must also give their consent, and this must also be in writing and have it acknowledged in the presence of the court. Consent can be withdrawn, so the parent or the child can withdraw their consent by written notice within 4 days of signing the written consent. And this consent effectively will terminate the biological parent's rights. The next question is, well, if consent is required, is there ever a situation where consent may not be needed, where it may not be required? And there are situations where the court may grant the adoption even if consent is not given. And it's important to keep in mind that this is really determined on a family by family basis. It's a very specific situation and multiple factors come into play. But generally, these are some of the situations where consent may not be needed. So if you can show that the biological parents effectively abandoned the child, you can show parent cannot be found after diligent search has been made, the parent is insane or incapacitated from surrendering such rights, meaning they don't really have the proper mental capacity to do so. The parent has failed to exercise proper prenatal care or control due to misconduct or inability. The parent has failed to communicate or make bona fide attempt to communicate with the child in a meaningful way, supportive, parental manner for a period of 1 year or longer prior to the filing of the adoption petition without justifiable cause. And the parent has failed to provide for the care and support of the child as required by law and the court for 1 year or longer prior to the filing of the adoption petition, and the court determines that the adoption is in the best interest of the child. So, as I've mentioned, these are some circumstances in which that consent, which the parent needs to give in writing, may not be necessary. Again, this is a very specific, it depends on your specific situation. So now I'd like to touch briefly upon the process for adoption. Adoption can be a very lengthy, time-consuming process involving several steps and many details, but my goal is to touch briefly upon the big ideas, the big steps here. So the first step is inquiry, where an prospective adoptive family would contact their local DFACS office or Homes for Georgia Kids and make an initial inquiry about adoption. So after this initial contact, this prospective adoptive family would receive a packet of information from their local DFACS office in which they would learn more about upcoming information sessions. This information session is the next step after the inquiry, where the prospective adoptive family would attend this session to learn more about the process. What is it like? What are the details? What is the timeline? What is the overall process for adoption? After the information session, then there is the pre-service training. And this is where, if the prospective adoptive family has decided that adoption is the right choice for expanding their family, then the prospective adoptive family would need to participate in the adoption preparation program. And this is offered through a local county Department of Family and Children Services or a comparable program. After the pre-service training, there will be a family evaluation. So once there's a successful pre-service training, the prospective adoptive family will undergo a family evaluation. And then this would be forwarded to the adoption exchange. At this point, the prospective adoptive families are now considered an available resource for a child waiting to be adopted. After the family evaluation, there's pre-placement. And this is the time between being approved as adoptive parents and having a child placed in the adoptive home. This timeline can vary. It really can take any amount of time, although identifying child available for adoption might decrease that waiting period. So during that waiting period, there are a number of things that adoptive families can do. They can go to adoption parties and match meetings, and there are support groups out there. So that waiting period can be, daunting, but there are things you can do in that time. After pre-placement, there's placement. So if there's a proposed match, and if it is feasible, pre-placement visits will be scheduled. And after a series of pre-placement visits, prospective adoptive families will sign a placement agreement, placing the child with the family. Then after placement, there's finalization. So upon receiving a release from DFACS, the prospective adoptive parents will file that petition, which is something we talked about before. You would file in the county where you reside, in the Superior Court of that county. And then once that petition has been filed, there will be a hearing, and it will be held in the county of the Superior Court. So that's the general process. As I mentioned, this can be a lengthy process with so many more details and so many more little steps involved. One thing I do want to take a moment to talk about is the home study and post-placement requirements in Georgia. So a home study and post-placement assessment is required for all prospective adoptive parents in Georgia. These assessments help determine whether the adoption placement is in the best interest of the child that is to be adopted. And these are some of the details about it. It can include at least 3 visits on separate days. At least 1 visit must take place in the home, and all family members must be seen and interviewed. During this interview process, there's a lot of information that is being gathered. So the things that they're trying to figure out is, well, what's the motivation to adopt? They're looking at the social background of each family member, evaluating parenting practices, summary of each family member's health history, current condition, informal assessment of each family member's emotional and mental health, description of the home and community, statements regarding the results of criminal records, child abuse and neglect registry checks, and at least 3 character references. So this home study really does look into your family, looks into really every aspect of it. It kind of opens you up for evaluation. So this is an important process that a lot of people have questions about. So it's important to keep that in mind. And those are the general steps in adoption. It's the general basics of adoption. If you have any future questions, or if you were looking for advice, you can, as I mentioned, contact legal aid by phone, or you can open up an intake online. Alternatively, or in addition to those, you can come meet me in the law library, where you can receive a free consultation if you qualify on qualifying matters. Thank you so much.